Grace, the owner of a small diner on a quiet street corner, had been struggling to keep her business afloat during these tough times. One rainy evening, an elderly, weary, and hungry man walked into her diner. Despite facing her own financial difficulties, Grace didn't hesitate to offer him a free meal. But what would happen when this man left behind an unexpected gift? Could Grace's kindness change not only her life but the future of her little diner? The answer might make you reflect deeply. The diner was a cozy place tucked into the quiet corner, with only 8 tables and a small counter. The red and white checkered curtains had faded, but Grace always kept everything clean. Every morning, she woke up at 3:30 a.m. to prepare the food, doing everything from scratch with the recipes her grandmother had taught her. The smell of freshly baked bread and fragrant soup filled the small kitchen as she worked alone to save on staff costs. Business had been slow recently. Grace glanced at the pile of bills scattered across the counter after closing. Her hands trembled as she counted the earnings for the day. It wasn't enough to pay the rent for the next month. She thought about her 2 children at home, Ethan, who was 15, and Lily, who was 10. They needed new school supplies, but she had no money. Grace wiped her eyes and continued counting, hoping she had made a mistake in her calculations. The weather forecast predicted rain for the week. Rainy days meant fewer customers. Grace sat in the empty diner, wondering if she should sell her wedding ring. Her husband had passed away. He would understand. Her children needed food. That evening, the rain poured heavily outside, and the streetlights cast long shadows through the diner windows. Grace was about to close early when the bell above the door rang. An elderly man entered, soaked from the rain. He stood silently by the door, water dripping onto the floor. His hair was white and messy, and his coat was full of holes. But his eyes were kind. Grace noticed he was thin, and his hands shook slightly as he clutched his old hat. Grace walked over to him with a warm smile. She saw that he looked embarrassed as the water from his clothes soaked into the clean floor. She grabbed a clean towel from behind the counter and handed it to him. "I haven't eaten in 3 days," the man said softly, his voice trembling. "I lost my job last month, and I spent all my last money on medicine." He lowered his gaze. "I don't have money for food." Grace remembered her first year in America, when she had to go to bed hungry, saving every penny to buy food for her children. The memory of that hunger was still vivid in her mind. She led the man to a table in the corner of the diner. "Don't worry about money today," she told him. The man tried to refuse, but Grace walked into the kitchen. She turned on the stove and began cooking. She wanted to make him a special meal, something that would warm both his body and soul. She made chicken soup with her grandmother's recipe, a dish she reserved only for family. The vegetables were fresh, and she added extra chicken this time. The soup simmered while she baked a fresh batch of bread. The warm, comforting smell filled the empty diner. As Grace cooked, her thoughts wandered to her father, who had passed away 10 years ago. This man reminded her of him, his gentle eyes and soft voice. She wondered if her father had ever gone hungry without telling anyone. The man sat quietly, gazing out the window, where the rain continued to fall relentlessly. Grace noticed him wiping his tears over and over. She pretended not to see, wanting to preserve his dignity. She knew how difficult it could be to accept help. Once the soup was ready, Grace placed a large portion of bread beside it. She also packed extra bread and a few cookies into a paper bag. She thought to herself that tomorrow he might be hungry again. She couldn't let that happen. She served him the meal with the same care she would show to her father. The man looked down at the steam rising from his bowl of soup. The portion was enough for 2, but Grace knew he needed it. His hands trembled as he picked up the spoon. He took the first spoonful. A tear rolled down his cheek as he tasted it. It reminds me of my mother's cooking," he said softly, his voice gentle. He began to tell her about the family meals of his childhood. Grace sat beside him as he ate. The diner was quiet, and she had the feeling that he needed her company more than the food. He introduced himself. "My name is Henry," he said. "I used to be an accountant before the company downsized last month." Henry ate slowly, savoring every bite. "I worked at that company for 30 years, he continued. "When they laid me off, they only gave me 2 weeks' pay." His voice grew heavy. My savings have been depleted by medical bills after my wife passed away last year. Grace listened and nodded, sharing a part of her own story. I came to America, lost my husband, and now I'm raising 2 children on my own, she said. She spoke about her dreams for the diner, her voice softening as she mentioned the current difficulties. Henry finished his meal and sat back with a satisfied sigh. Color had returned to his face. He looked different, more alive. He reached into the pocket of his old coat and pulled out a small notebook. His hands were steady now as he wrote something. Grace began to clear his dishes. "Please take the paper bag with you," she said. Henry smiled. "Thank you. No one has treated me this kindly in years," he said, his eyes lighting up as he took one last look around the diner. When Henry stood to leave, he placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Grace hurried to stop him. "You don't need to leave anything," she said, but he just smiled and walked toward the door. The rain had stopped by now. He turned back, looking at her once more before stepping outside. Grace watched him disappear into the night. She approached his table, hoping to find a thank you note. What she found made her sit down in shock. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper and read the words written on it. At first, Grace thought her eyes were deceiving her. She read it more again. Each time, her heart raced faster. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The note was not just a thank you. It was a business card and a handwritten letter. Henry was not an ordinary accountant. He had once been the senior financial advisor for one of the largest restaurant chains in the city. The company that had laid him off was a major investment firm. The letter explained, "I've been following your diner for the past few weeks. I've seen how you treat every customer like family. I've noticed your dedication to the quality of your food. I'm looking for someone like you, someone with both talent and heart." Henry wrote, "I have very strong connections in the restaurant industry. I promise I will return tomorrow with investors. I see the potential in your little diner. Your kindness tonight has shown me that you're the kind of person we want to work with." Grace's hands trembled as she read the part about his connections. He mentioned names she had seen in business magazines, people who owned restaurant chains across the country. It was hard for her to believe that they would be interested in her small diner. She stayed up late that night, continuing to clean everything again. Her mind spun. Was this real? She thought about her children, about finally being able to buy them new clothes. Grace thought about paying off her debts, about expanding the diner. The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual. She brewed fresh coffee and toasted more bread. Every time the doorbell rang, her heart raced. She nervously watched each customer who walked in, wondering if they were the investors Henry had mentioned. By noon, a group of men in suits entered. Henry was with them, looking completely different. The suit he wore now looked expensive, and his posture was upright and confident. But his kind eyes were still the same. He smiled at Grace, as if they were sharing a secret. The investors sat at different tables and ordered from the menu. "This looks amazing," one of them said, glancing at his menu. In the kitchen, Grace's hands shook slightly as she cooked, but she poured all her love into every dish. She remembered what her grandmother used to say, "Food made with love always tastes better." They stayed at the diner for 2 hours, speaking quietly among themselves. Grace watched as they nodded in approval while savoring their meals. Henry walked around the diner, showing them every corner. "This is where the magic happens," he said, gesturing to the walls and windows. The investors took notes and made a few phone calls. Before leaving, the investors gathered at Grace's counter. "We want to invest in your diner," one of them said. "Our plan is to keep everything you love about it, but help it grow. We want to open 5 more locations in the city." The changes began to take place quickly. They hired more staff so that Grace wouldn't have to work alone anymore. All her recipes were kept the same. "Your grandmother's chicken soup will be our signature dish," one investor said. "It's the soul of the diner." In just 6 months, Grace's diner had completely transformed. They expanded the space by renting the adjacent room. The familiar plaid curtains remained, but everything else was lightly refreshed. The regular customers continued to come every day, delighted to see that the flavors and service hadn't changed. Henry became Grace's business advisor. He helped her understand the numbers and the contracts, but he never mentioned that rainy night again. Occasionally, when he ate the soup, Grace would catch him smiling, his eyes reflecting the same warmth from that first evening. Finally, Grace was able to buy new school supplies for her children. She moved her family to a better apartment, one closer to the school. Ethan and Lily were proud of their mother. They helped at the diner on weekends, learning the recipes just as Grace had from her grandmother. A year later, all 5 new locations were up and running. Each one had the same plaid curtains and cozy atmosphere as the first diner. Grace personally trained each chef, teaching them her grandmother's secret recipes. Remember, she told them, every customer should feel like family. The best part was that she could now hire people who needed help. Grace remembered her own difficult days. She offered jobs to single parents and students, ensuring that everyone had enough to eat. No one leaves this diner hungry, she told her staff, whether they pay or not. Henry still visited weekly for his bowl of soup. Your kindness that night wasn't just about the meal, he told Grace. It was about respect, about treating people with dignity. That's what makes you special. That's what makes your diner a success. Grace kept the note Henry had left her that night. She framed it and hung it in her office. It reminded her that kindness could change lives in unexpected ways. Sometimes, when she looked at it, she thought about how one small act of compassion had transformed not just her life, but so many others as well. This story isn't just about kindness. It's about the power of small actions that can change a whole life. Grace didn't hesitate to help a stranger, and that opened up an opportunity she could never have imagined. Have you ever experienced a life-changing moment thanks to someone else's help? Share your story in the comments. Your voice could inspire many others. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it with your friends and family, so together we can spread the message of compassion and selflessness. Thank you so much for your continued support of the channel. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. During the content creation process, there may have been some small mistakes, and we hope you'll kindly overlook them. Wishing everyone happiness, peace, and good health in life. Stay tuned for more.